In August of 1945, the United States dropped two bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. Despite the sheer devastation caused by the bombs, the decision to drop these atomic bombs ultimately spared many American and Japanese lives by bringing a much swifter end to World War II. This swift end to the war caused mass debate due to the fact that the bombs were so destructive. In the subsequent years, however, monumental efforts were made to repair the relationship between the United States and Japan. The Pacific War. The United States of America and Japan fought in the Pacific Ocean for close to 5 years. These two countries began the militaristic actions due to the desires of the Japanese to compete with the industrialized nations of the Western world. This desire led Japan to invade many smaller, Western-controlled islands in the Pacific Ocean. Eventually, this ambition caused the Japanese to ambush the U.S. naval base, Pearl Harbor, in Hawaii, at the time a U.S. territory, causing the U.S. to declare war, and, due to this decision, they became involved in the Second World War. The U.S. fought alongside the Allies, France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and, to a lesser extent, China, against the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The United States and Japan had been enemies since they joined the war, and the invasion of U.S.-controlled islands by Japan certainly did not help the relations between these two countries. The invasion of Okinawa, which lasted from April to June of 1945, was the last battle fought in the Pacific War, and, by that time, American soldiers and civilians were tired of the constant state of war the U.S. was in and the amount of death that had happened thus far. Almost 300,000 American deaths were caused by these conflicts, in addition to almost 2 million Japanese deaths. The estimated death count of the American army, if they'd invaded the Japanese mainland, was almost 250,000, and for the Japanese army, it was around 50 million. President Truman realized this and thought of two options: drop the newly developed nuclear bombs, or go through with an invasion of the Japanese mainland. Truman then took one of the most controversial decisions of any president to date. He decided to drop Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima and Fat Man on the city of Kokura. The day Fat Man was dropped, the weather over Kokura was too cloudy to see the target, so they decided to drop it on their secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was the second choice due to the fact that it was a major industrial hub in Japan. On August 6th, the day the first bomb was dropped, there was mass debate across the entire world about whether it was ethical or not. While the world was debating over the dropping of the first bomb, the U.S. dropped a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Over 70% of all buildings were blown down from the blast force of the bomb. Ground temperatures reached over 4,000 degrees Celsius, and radioactive rain immediately poured down onto both cities. It was nearly impossible to provide aid because of the mass amounts of nuclear radiation. Those who survived the initial blast were not out of the woods yet, as the bombs caused mass amounts of nuclear fallout and disease throughout all of Japan and parts of Eastern Asia. This sudden increase in nuclear radiation caused cancer and other nuclear-related diseases, and ultimately killed almost all of the people who were able to survive the initial blast. Only about 100,000 people survived the two nuclear bombs. The survivors, who are still alive today, called the Hibakusha, still suffer from radiation poisoning, cancer, and other diseases. Here are some pictures drawn by the Hibakusha, which show how much mental damage, in addition to physical, they sustained. Nuclear shadows are made when the heat and UV radiation from a nuclear explosion changes the color of surfaces such as buildings and pavement. Objects also get plastered onto those surfaces due to the intense heat and blast force. These nuclear shadows are a big part of World War II history and show us just how devastating these bombs really were and how much damage they really did. The death toll in both cities were massive, totaling around 2.5 million people, most dying from radiation after the fact. The amount of people that were estimated to die from a mainland invasion is much larger than the amount of people who died in the bombings. The global debate around the dropping of the atomic bomb was massive during the time, and is still a big topic for debate today. Most of the world thought that the bombs were too destructive and that the United States was insensitive to the fact that they killed hundreds of thousands of civilians rather than trying to only kill the military. Most of the world thought that the dropping of the bombs was not the correct decision and that the United States should have gone through with an invasion of the Japanese mainland. The facts tell us that this would not have been the superior decision. This is due to the fact that every man, woman, and child who could fight would fight for their country. Americans, on the other hand, widely accepted the bombings and thought that it was the superior decision over an invasion of the Japanese mainland. There might have been some political bias due to the fact that Harry S. Truman was giving an easy way out of the war to the American people, which is exactly what they wanted. The American population was in great turmoil due to the amount of American deaths and amount of tragedy that was happening in Europe and the Pacific Theater. The Americans and some of the Allied forces thought that the A-bombs were the better decision because of the fact that there would have been many more deaths if there was a land invasion. Those who opposed the bombings of the two cities argued that it was morally unjustified, militarily unnecessary, a war crime, and a form of terrorism. Essentially, the people who were against the bomb thought this was not a genuine military tactic, but simply an act of terrorism. Most critics thought that a military blockade and a conventional bombing of Japan, followed by a storming of the beaches, would have been the more humane option. This is not a valid reason because, we can see in history, when there is less conflict, there is less death. This is seen on D-Day, when the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. Almost all of the Nazis guarding the beach died, and more than 50% of the Allied soldiers died. The biggest point that is made by the people who oppose dropping the bombs is that they caused the arms race and the Cold War. If the US never dropped the bombs, the Cold War might not have happened, and the Russians and the Chinese might not have been in the militaristic position that they're in today. Most countries today have enough nuclear bombs to destroy a fair percentage of the world, and the anti-bomb people think that if the United States would have gone through with a land invasion of Japan, then the world might have been a less war-ridden place and not have as many nuclear bombs. Debate over this controversial topic still happens today, with 56% of America thinking that the bombs are justified. Compared to the 85% of people who supported this decision back in 1945, most of the world is in support of the bombings, and the people who do not support the bombings make up a very small percentage, with most of them coming from Japan and Eastern Asia. Even though these bombs were quite destructive and did massive amounts of physical and mental damage, they were a better decision over an invasion of the Japanese mainland.